Greetings, everyone. If you're on with us now, we're just going to hold for one moment and we'll start right at noon time. So it's great to have you here. Hopefully you're somewhere that's warm and beautiful day. So we'll get started in just one moment. Well, hi everyone, this is Bill Kenny and I'm with Test My Pitch. We welcome you today for our webinar on criteria conundrum. In other words, how do we develop good criteria for our pitch events and for various types of evaluations we might do. So what we're going to do, just so you understand the format, obviously I'm on screen right now. I'm going to go off screen in just a moment and we'll put some slides up. We've got some good content, I think, for you. And then I'll come back on screen and answer your questions. So I would suggest that if you do have questions as we're going along, whether you're in through YouTube or Google+, you should be able to post questions. And I actually have the questions scrolling on my screen. So when I do go to slides, I won't see them, but when I come back on screen, I'll be able to see any questions that you've posted and we'll address those as well. So in any event, we really appreciate you being here with us today and certainly look forward to sharing this content with you as we get going. So I'm going to now switch to the screen share mode where I can go to the slides that I have, and we're doing that right now. So let me share my screen with you. So hopefully now you see my slides, which is criteria conundrum. And again, the goal is to help you develop your ultimate pitch evaluation rubric. So there's, just by way of background here, we go to, as an organization, somewhere between 150 and 200 pitch events a year. So we get to see lots of different criteria. We get to see lots of different judging methodologies and techniques. And so a lot of what we're going to share with you today is really what we've learned over the course of the last 3 years as we've observed all of these different events. And we've been to probably some of the most nascent early stage events to some of the most sophisticated events that are going on around the world in any ecosystem. So again, we'll look to share as much as we can about that with you, and hopefully you get a lot out of it. So just so you understand some context, today's audience, we've got various personas. So we have some folks from corporate innovation, some folks from education, particularly business and entrepreneurship education, and then we have some folks from various types of economic development, primarily some accelerators and incubators. And this content is really designed to sort of bridge all three of those different viewpoints or opportunities. This is posting of the various questions that have been submitted. We'll definitely get to these as we're going through, and then we'll come back to make sure that we answered each of them at the end as well. And certainly, again, we invite you to submit additional questions. We love getting to your questions. So just so we have some real focus here, this problem around criteria isn't just something that you've realized by being involved in this topic today, but it's also something that Steve Blank has spoken quite a bit about. And of course, this quote, he says, "Incubator demo days encourage founders and investors to judge startups on the wrong criteria." And we certainly echo this. We observe this almost at every pitch event we go to. Quite often the criteria is really misaligned with what is intended or should be intended. So our agenda, real simply, is going to be, we're going to talk about sort of common challenges we see with judging, some remedies for your system. We're going to focus on developing the best rubric. We'll talk about judge selection and orientation. We'll share with you our criteria development worksheet, and in fact, we'll send it out to you when we actually post this webinar. We'll include with that our criteria development worksheet. And again, we'll get to your questions and any additional questions you submit today. Just so you know a little bit about me, I'm the founder of Test My Pitch, and we've been at this now about 3 years. This is our 6th startup, so I don't know if that's ADD or what it is, but we tend to see problems and want to solve them. I personally go to more than 100 pitch events a year, and so really have gotten to see quite a bit about what's going on and where the opportunities are within communication development and also within effective pitching and pitch evaluation. The disclaimer that we would throw out, and I guess we throw out with all of these, is, you know, that we all, when we come to topics like this, we're all playing a somewhat different movie in our head. And so the movie that I'm playing in my head is certainly what I'm going to share with you today. You may be playing a different set of circumstances or scenarios, and I certainly, and we as an organization certainly invite those conversations to really understand what's going on in your community, and if there are some differences here, where we may be able to understand better and possibly help. And certainly glad to listen and also share what we're seeing through this communication, and then certainly ideally post-webinar and any conversations we might have. Just so you understand a little bit about us, and again, our goal here isn't to do any commercial, but Test My Pitch itself is an online platform that helps, it could be students, entrepreneurs, or professionals, improve their communication skills. So there is a component that allows very quick drafting of communications, posting, and then feedback. And the feedback can come from the community, it can come from mentors, but essentially it's a closed system. So we create private online communities for communication development. We're used in schools, we're used in universities, in various accelerators and incubators, as well as some corporations. Score My Pitch is very simply a pitch event judging and feedback system. So if you've been to a pitch event, that piece of paper the judges use to submit their scores, Score My Pitch is an electronic version of that. And by going electronic and using some of the methodologies we've used, we've reduced or almost eliminated score skewing, and also the challenges that come with judge meetings. And our judge meetings tend to be very short, and very little skewing happens through our tool. So what does that mean? It means we end up with more reliable results and more informative results. So that's really the goal. All right, so let's get into our content here. Enough of this talk about preamble. So first we want to really talk about how criteria relates to reliable judging. What is it about criteria that makes it valuable for judging? And so to understand this, we really need to understand and kind of back up to really what outcomes we're looking to generate from pitch events. And we've sort of defined 3 purposes that we've observed of pitch events, or 3 potential purposes. And depending on sort of where your program is, or where this part of your program is, you might be at any one of these 3 purposes. So the first purpose, and these are really gateway or entry level events, but it's really about engagement. It's really about getting people in for their first experience. And the goal of these events, more often than not, is to get them back for their second experience. So we're going to have a certain tactic or technique we'll use to do that. The second sort of phase or level is education. So these are going to be for individuals that are a little bit deeper down the pipeline, and we're going to look to improve their skills and to really have an effect on their trajectory. And the third is really about performance. So this might be a competition, it might be a funding event, but ultimately, and it could be an exit event, but ultimately it's where we have an expectation of completion at this point. And so with each of these different purposes, we're going to evolve different criteria, and we need to make sure we understand that each of these should have a different type of criteria and really some different focus. So when we look at this, in terms of stages, what we're really going to look at is the engagement stage. We're going to deal with a much bigger population. And then as we go to educate, we're going to have filtered out some folks. And as we get down to perform, an even smaller community. And so engagement is really about sort of getting the maximum number of people to the next level. And then it's really about sort of how do we take that number of people and give them skills and knowledge that allow them to perform well. And again, that sort of natural selection process happens as we go through each of these. And so we, again, need to evolve our criteria so that we winnow and wean appropriately. So another way to look at these program stages, certainly engage and educate, look the same here, but we evolve, perform to exit. And so there are certainly programs that send their cohorts or their participants out into the greater ecosystem. And so a big part of that sort of exit or final performance is about how ready are you for the next step, whatever that might be, and how good is this handoff? Do we have you prepared for sort of where you might go from here, whether that's to investment, whether that's to a launch, whatever that appropriate next stage is. But it may be less about performance and more about making sure you're ready for that next step and an appropriate exit. And again, our criteria and our judging process should correspond to each of these stages. So with that, we've sort of observed 5 challenges with judging, and there may be more that you realize, but these are the sort of the top 5 as we see them. We've seen situations where the judging process is aimed at serving the wrong audience, and we continue to see this actually, where organizations will tell us that they've selected their judges or their criteria to serve. Maybe it's the sponsors, maybe it's the judges, but ultimately, if it's around the ventures and it's around be those students, be those seasoned entrepreneurs, ultimately, if we're building a system around that cohort and it's a valuable cohort, we shouldn't have any problem attracting sponsors and sort of helpful judges. And again, when we develop these criteria and/or the judging process around the judges or around the sponsors, then we forego the objectives quite often that we would have for who we're really trying to serve, which are either the students or the cohort, the entrepreneurs, maybe the entrepreneurs, but any of those audiences. Ultimately, understanding who the audience is and developing the criteria to them is key. So misaligned criteria, we talked earlier about the stages that a program might have. We want to make sure that our criteria are aligned with those stages and with the outcomes that we're looking to have. So really key that when we have these misalignments, that we recognize that and get things back in line. Lack of judge and venture orientation. So it's probably more normal that we see organizations spending time, maybe a few minutes, maybe 15 minutes or something, orienting the judges before they sit down. But we don't very often see a venture or student or entrepreneur orientation. And so there are a variety of things that we want to orient folks about. Certainly the judges on the criteria. The venture should also have, in fact, long before the judges know the criteria, the ventures should know the criteria. They should know what they're aligning themselves to, what they should be focused on and communicating about, because we want to set people up for success. And likewise, another part of orientation for ventures might be how do you listen and respond to questions? How do you listen and respond to feedback? All those types of things that a venture might or an entrepreneur might need to know in order to perform at their absolute best and to really get the most out of that opportunity. Score skewing. Yeah, this is something that can happen in a bunch of different ways. Two primary ways that we see. Number one is there's a natural skewing that happens in any kind of paper-based judging, and then it's not even just paper, but it's a sort of a manual process. It could be vocal scoring or written scoring, but it's very normal that after the third or fourth performance, and this could be pitching, this could be gymnastics, it could be any kind of scoring of this nature, but it's very normal that after the third or fourth performance that the judges' scores begin to skew. And so it's really important that any system used removes that or reduces that skewing. And it's unfortunate that actually judges, if you have a panel of 4 or 5 judges, their scores actually skew differently. So it's not even that we can say they're going to skew this direction and this much. It's not that simple. And so we want to make sure we evolve that out. The other place where judges score skew, or the other sort of major place, is if judges caucus to make decisions. So in other words, they've done their judging, they've observed all the performances, and then they go into a room and sequester for a few minutes to a half hour, whatever it is. That's another place where skewing happens, and that's more often than not a more charismatic or louder person who can tend to carry the conversation and influence or dominate others into sort of into their point of view. And so that's like a whole nother set of judging that happens in the absence of the ventures or of the participants. And so but it's key that both of these kinds of skewing gets resolved in order to have more reliable scores. And more reliable scores are really critical from a bunch of different viewpoints. In fact, we just did a blog post on this, which I'll be glad to forward out to folks as follow-up. But when you don't have reliable judging, it can really negatively influence what happens. So poor execution, and this is actually intended to be an image of a judge's meeting where we see maybe some poor execution, but where maybe things have devolved down into a bunch of small conversations and people negotiating their points of view and so on. But ultimately, it's about in the situation of a judge's meeting, having a facilitator, something like that, where you have someone in there that doesn't influence the conversation in terms of outcome, but guides the judges through a process and is independent of judging themselves. They're merely there to help the judges navigate a process to confirm sort of their consensus. And we found with facilitators, the process not only is more reliable, but also much more effective and much quicker. So let's talk about some remedies now that we've identified kind of the top 5 challenges. So when we think about developing our best rubric, it's really first and foremost about sort of looking further out and really being able to understand the outcome that you want. And when we look at creating a rubric, and this is actually sort of a mock-up of one of our clients' ballots in our Score My Pitch system, but you'll see this particular client has 8 criteria, and so for them this was kind of the right answer, and they have those criteria split into 2 different categories: business model evaluation and then business plan evaluation. Ultimately with this, it's really about looking far enough out to identify sort of what outcomes you want, and then aligning those outcomes with the criteria you're going to choose, and also overlaying that with what stage the ventures or the participants are at, and we'll get into that in just a moment. Another sort of representation, and this you can see as opposed to being 8 criteria, this particular ballot is 5 criteria. And again, the organization that uses this criteria ultimately has a somewhat modified set of goals, and they have definitely different participants and who are at different stages than the ones that we just looked at. So when we're developing our criteria, when we kind of apply this idea to our program stages, it's actually really interesting. So we want to move at the engagement stage from being positive and focused on developing individual commitment to being more direct and focusing on individual improvement. And so that scale is going to slide. It's not all or nothing. It's going to move from, say, 90% focused on being positive and focusing on commitment to and 10% on being direct and improvement, and engage to being, say, 90% focused on being direct and focused on improvement in the performance stage, and 10% focused on garnering commitment at that later stage. And so again, you're going to slide this scale a bit as you evolve through these stages. So the easiest way to think of this is that you're going at an engagement stage, you're focused on evaluating form. And did you get up? Did you speak well? Did you sort of follow the basic format and hit all the high points? Not necessarily that your content was good. We're going to evaluate your substance later, or we're going to focus more on your substance later. Again, the goal at this engagement stage is to get them to come back a second time, and it's really to get them committed into the program. I've seen, just to give you some examples here, we were recently at a collegiate pitch event at a university that will go unnamed, and these were all sort of idea stage entrepreneurs, very nascent skill sets, and so this was they gave, I think it was 2-minute pitches, and the evaluation that was given to them and that the judges were asked to evaluate on were all investor level criteria. And so there were several challenges. None of these ventures were anywhere close to being ready for investment. And so the feedback they got and the sort of the scoring they got was really irrelevant to the stage they were at. In fact, it was quite discouraging, as you can imagine. And so it would be very difficult to expect to see any of those students come back for a second sort of bite of the apple, and that's a real hazard in this. Likewise, we've seen situations where there have been very mature ventures, and early stage criteria has been used to evaluate them. So what you'll see is, as the ventures mature, they're going to really crave more information. And if you don't give them more information, if you're not more direct, if you're not more critical, then they're not going to feel like they're getting much out of your program. And so you have to continue to evolve the sophistication of the evaluation that's being done, continuing to give people nourishment so they feel like it's valuable for them to remain and that they're getting good content, that they're getting valuable feedback, and in fact they're able to continue to evolve. And so again, if we do that too early, we're going to discourage people. But if we don't get more sophisticated as we go, we're going to in just the same way discourage people from continuing, because at least continuing in our program, because they're not, as that old Wendy's commercial said, they're going to say, where's the beef? I need sustenance. So the highest value feedback, it really comes in two forms. And the easiest way to think of this, when we think of how do we give ventures, entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs feedback, we hear about quantitative and qualitative information and feedback. The easiest way to imagine it is to think about the feedback you get when you're driving your car. The one that we think of immediately is that we get all this feedback from the dashboard. We get to know how fast we're going, what our tachometer says in terms of our RPMs, how much fuel we have, the heat of our engine, how many miles we've gone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we get all this data that comes in and is wonderful. But the other part we get is qualitative, and that is what we see through the rear view mirror, through all of our windows, the windshield and the side windows and the rear window. We get lots of qualitative information. Imagine if we took away, either the quantitative or the qualitative feedback. Just, it doesn't really matter which one. It would truly be impossible to continue to drive your car without both types of feedback. And the funny thing is, quite often we go in and observe programs where, number one, generally there is no feedback or it's anecdotal. But if there is actual hard feedback shared, in other words, written, sort of quantitative or qualitative feedback shared, quite often organizations, so let's say 50% don't share anything. So of the 50% that do share something, they generally choose to share either just the quantitative or just the qualitative information. And it's very much the same for the ventures. The qualitative information acts to modify and to, in fact, qualify the quantitative information. It actually tells us, we'll actually know why we got a 3 out of 5 more definitively because of the qualitative feedback we're going to get. And so it's really important that, of course, when we look at our speedometer and it says we're going 60 miles an hour, we look out the windshield, we actually know what 60 miles an hour looks like. Kind of important to have that relationship. And it's the same thing with venture feedback. And so we want to make sure that we give people both quantitative and qualitative feedback so that they get as much context as they can possibly get. And so when we get feedback, and it's kind of most programs that we see give feedback orally. In other words, maybe the judges or maybe mentors give feedback, and it usually comes orally, and that's very hard for most of us to contextualize. And in fact, you'll see from this graphic that most of us actually are visual learners. And so it's funny, we want to give good feedback, and we do it orally, when in fact most people don't really know how to rationalize that feedback, and it's not very contextual, because all we're getting is sort of this this oral feedback, and it's generally not quantitative, and it's not criteria based, and it's not, your criteria may not be consistent with her criteria and his criteria and so on. And so part of what good criteria and good evaluations do at the very first part is that we want to make sure that it's consistent sort of across sort of all individuals who are giving feedback, so that everybody is using the same rubric. And then second is that the feedback that anyone receives, the more that it can be written and both qualitative and quantitative, the more individuals will be able to internalize and action that feedback. And that's really, ultimately with communication, it really doesn't matter what you say, it's what other people hear. And if we can communicate to people in a way that complements their learning style, they're going to get a lot more out of it, and in fact be able to evolve much quicker from that. So again, it doesn't really matter what we say or how we say it, as long as it resonates with the receiver. So how does that all sort of manifest itself? So here's one representation, and again, this is just using our system, but it is certainly one organization's answer to this problem, and that is and again, this is a totally different scorecard. So earlier we were looking at judge ballots. This is actually the results, and you'll see this is a different event than the 2 ballots we looked at. It's only 3 criteria, but you'll see the individual venture scores on each criteria, totals, their ranking, and so on. And then to the right, you'll see the text feedback. And besides strengths, if we could go further to the right, you'd see recommendations. And so the idea here is that on any of these criteria, we can go through and see what our score is, understand from the text how we improve that score, even look if this information is being democratized, which we highly recommend, is that we can actually see how we compare on each criteria and overall to other participants and see what their comments were, so that, again, it gives us even more dimension to our comments, is to have others we can model, others we can compare to. There's nothing that helps us evolve quicker than to have people or examples of what better looks like. And if we can mimic others or even leapfrog others' skills and capabilities, that's generally what we found to be the very, very fastest way to help individuals evolve. So let's hop into talking about selecting and orienting judges. So judges ultimately are critically important, and making sure that certainly that they're able to fairly evaluate, and also that that there's a good win in it for them to be involved. So judges come from a variety of sort of backgrounds. So we may have some investors, some executives, sponsors of the program. We may have faculty or entrepreneurs, mentors, and others who would be judges for our program. And so the really cool thing about this is, it's really kind of a couple of opportunities here. Number one is to get these individuals to give our ventures feedback. 2 is that we can now engage and give more ownership of these venture success to our community. And so getting people engaged, involved in judging is really an opportunity to get more people behind your program. And so getting them in and doing some orientation is really key. And so from an orientation standpoint, the first thing, and this is actually where a lot of organizations fail, they may have evolved good criteria, but they more often than not forget to be very precise and communicate what the context of the event is. What's the purpose of this event? What's the purpose of this judging? In other words, these are all sort of very early stage entrepreneurs. Our goal today is really to identify who's done the most customer discovery, or that they're, who's done the best or most reliable customer discovery, or which idea is best, or who communicates the best, or moving to more sophisticated, which one is most scalable and fundable. But having that context, it's not a criteria, but it modifies the criteria so that anyone looking at that criteria knows how they should interpret it. And I think the assumption that we have learned is that, the judges, if we have a panel of 5 judges and we have an evening event, so our judges have been working all day and then they come to our facility to do judging, is that they're, all day they've been focused on other stuff. Maybe they're an investor, maybe they're an attorney. And so they come from that frame of reference. They've been sort of, last 8 or 10 hours sort of ensconced in that world. And without reframing them, they're just going to apply. They're going to continue because, a body at rest continues to remain at rest. A body at motion will continue, as you know, to remain in motion. And so unless we reframe them to focus, sort of bring them to where we are now and how we need them to interpret these criteria, they're going to just apply their frame of reference to it. And so making sure we have clearly defined the event purpose and the context of the criteria is key. Certainly reviewing the criteria, talking about the event format, are we going to have a break? Are we just going to run straight through and do all the pitches? What the scoring process is and any sort of details about that so that they're comfortable with how they score and what they do with their scores when they're done. And then if there is going to be a judge meeting, what does that look like and what are the expectations of that? But just so they know what's going on, even talking about if there's going to be a slight break between pitches to allow them to catch up on scoring, any of those types of things, or if you expect them to make a signal when they're done doing their scores in between pitches, anything like that that will help the event go smoothly. So when we look at feedback, and of course the judges are going to be the ones along ideally with the audience that generates your feedback, you're really going from a place where you're being positive and direct to as your ventures move from being novice to being expert, and again looking at evolving each individual's level of commitment at the early stages to their level of improvement at the later stages. And so when we look at this chart or grid, ultimately that's really the goal, is that we evaluate our feedback so that it's congruent with the sort of our event purpose and the stage of our ventures. So, as I mentioned earlier, making sure that sort of part of the job here is to make sure the evaluation is done well and it's reliable, but the sort of the other half of the equation is make sure the receiver is ready to receive that information. In other words, are our ventures excited and interested to hear feedback, no matter what the feedback is? And so we need to make sure that our orientation and training around that is just as important. So here's, if I were going to say that sort of one point in all of this is something that is probably most missed and maybe most important ultimately. And so we hear from organizations quite often about the concern that, one judge or two judges just didn't get it and they did a poor job and their feedback wasn't good, or whatever the case might be. And so there's a tendency to want to protect entrepreneurs from this sort of quote unquote bad feedback. And our point of view is that all feedback is perfect, and really what's missing is enough orientation for our cohort and our ventures so that they know how to react to feedback. And so, the problem is if we protect our ventures from feedback as they're going through our program, they're not going to know how to react when a customer gives them feedback, or when an employee or a vendor or an investor gives them feedback that is incongruent, that doesn't seem rational to them. It's really important that we give them all feedback, unvarnished, unqualified, as directly as possible, and begin to help them evolve that muscle of interpreting feedback. Because again, and it's funny, if entrepreneurs were artists, they would learn how to critique and be critiqued very early in what they're doing. And that's a huge part of evolving your skill as an artist. But in entrepreneurship education, we tend to be very protective, sort of mama bear, protecting our sort of cubs and making sure that nothing bad happens to them. And ultimately, at least what we've seen is that tends to evolve in nature in entrepreneurs, where we're defensive about our ideas as opposed to really wanting to hear what others say, that could really help propel us forward, or at least give us another data point. And again, not all feedback is relevant. That's not really the point, but all feedback is important because, again, particularly at the early stages, we need to evolve that muscle about how to listen to and to really filter feedback so that we are able to evolve as quickly as we can, yeah, and as effectively as we can. So coming from the standpoint that all feedback is perfect and having our ventures embrace feedback in a new and positive way, at least we found really changes the dynamic in terms of when they go out to do customer discovery, when they're building their team, when they're working with investors and vendors and so on, their readiness to listen and their ability to listen and evolve from listening changes dramatically. Yeah, and certainly Voltaire's comment, "Perfect is the enemy of the good," certainly applies to this whole process. Is we're looking to create perfection. Well, it's messy in the sausage factory, and we need to evolve through that. Where feedback isn't going to be perfect. Some systems aren't going to be perfect. They only get perfect with exercise, and the more we get out and exercise them, the closer we get to doing well. So venture orientation should be somewhat similar to the judge orientation, but it should include, sort of what our objective is, what the criteria are. We should talk about listening. Something that is missing at almost 100% of the pitch events that we go to is that there's not someone on the team assigned to take notes when there are judge questions or judge feedback. Generally, people are just listening to it and nodding or disagreeing with it or whatever they're doing, but nobody's taking notes, nobody's recording it or anything like that. We should orient them on how to respond to questions or how to respond to feedback, and how to use and digest that feedback is also key. And then if there is follow-up allowed, and if so, what's the best way to do follow-up with whether it's judges or mentors or whatnot, so that again, your goal is certainly first and foremost to build good ventures, but it's also to build a good community. And people are following up well, it is a credit to you. So a quick highlight on the criteria development worksheet. We're going to share this with you. We'll send this to you in PDF form, but it's something we've developed that should be a really quick and easy guide to help you draft a set of criteria fairly quickly. And I'm not going to kind of go through this in detail. I'm happy to answer any questions offline that anyone has. And but very simply, we're going to sort of go through what is the length of the pitches that are going to be happening. Are there slides or no slides? What would you identify as the primary purpose? We've got a few here, but obviously you could have other. And then it's really about how do you align what are the critical elements of evaluation based on that objective. And so then it's, once you brainstorm on that, then it's really about picking the top number. And you may use this little grid that we've created in terms of, if the pitches are less, a minute or less, then you may not want to have more than 3 criteria. If it's 1 to 5 minutes, then maybe 3 to 4 criteria, and then 5 to 10, and so on. And the reason we sort of cap or put a range on the number of criteria, and certainly there are times when you want to go a little bit more and a little bit less than this guide. But the reason is because we found that there's a correspondence between the number of criteria and the amount of text comments that you will get. In other words, the more criteria you have, more often than not, the less text comments you'll have, because the judges are spending so much time putting in quantitative scores that they don't have very much time to put in qualitative comments. And so we found that there's a balance between those two. And so again, you'll learn as you, again, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And so the whole goal of this is to help you get a good, reliable start, and then you'll evolve it as you do more events and have more experience. And ultimately, with the worksheet, you're just identifying which, based on the brainstorming you've done and whatever sort of maximum number of criteria you want to have, you identify the criteria that you want to use for this sort of first use case. And so now we'd love to get to your questions. And in a moment, I'm going to come back on screen and we'll do that. Certainly, again, feel free to submit any others electronically. We'll hop into these questions. Just so you know, before we do that, our next webinar is going to be focused on onboarding challenges. And so how do we ramp up communication competence of new team members, new employees? And so we'll really focus on that. We've actually been talking to a lot of organizations who are struggling in that area and spending a lot of management time, wasting a lot of management time, spending a lot of money on going through this process, and in some cases only to find out that the person wasn't a very good fit. And so we've got some thoughts on that, some things we've seen really work very well there. And this next webinar, of course, is going to be on Thursday, September 22nd at noon Eastern time in the US. And just so you know, within the next few days, certainly before the end of the week, we'll send you an email to follow up from this webinar. We'll include the criteria development worksheet. We'll include a link to the recording of this webinar. We will absolutely be excited and gratified with any feedback you want to share with us based on this webinar and this experience. Certainly, we love both critical and complimentary, whatever is appropriate for your point of view, and certainly would be excited to have any further conversation with you, and certainly if there are things we didn't answer or other topics you'd like to go into, we would certainly be excited about that. So without further ado, let me come back on screen. And I'll stop the screen sharing. And there we go. Hi, I'm back on screen. Okay, so I'm just grabbing the questions. So what I did as we were putting this together is we grouped the questions that came in 3 different categories. So one is actually, the first one's based on the criteria itself. The second is based on score skewing. And the third is about questions about the judging process and result reliability. So I'm going to, for the questions that I can kind of mush together here, I'll do that so we have some efficiency. But so the first question is in the criteria categories: what are the top 3 steps to creating valuable criteria? So first is to really define the audience. Who is it that's going to be pitching? Are these young students? Are there new students, new entrepreneurs? Are these seasoned folks? But really being specific about who's going to be pitching, and then what the goal you have for them is, and what stage they're at, and that of course will help us align what we're doing. And then it's really identifying the criteria that will support that goal and that stage. And ultimately, you should find that our criteria development worksheet walks you right through that process. So again, more questions on that. Let's talk offline for sure. What makes criteria effective is the next question. So when we think about effective criteria, it's really, are you fulfilling the outcome that you intended? So if we have sort of new entrepreneurs coming into our ecosystem, are we giving them the feedback that supports them coming back for a second experience? Whereas if we're dealing with stage 2 ventures who are on their their B round and they're very sophisticated and so on, are we giving them the critical feedback that is really supporting their goals and objectives in terms of getting investment and moving their venture forward. And so in each case, they're going to be completely different criteria because the outcome that we're looking for is considerably different. So it's really about making sure we know that audience and aligning everything that we're doing to sort of our goal for that audience and the stage they're at. Let's see, what are typical defects you see in criteria? How do you know that criteria is right for your event? So defects, again, it's that misalignment, mismatching of criteria to both the stage and the sort of venture sophistication. That's really really key. So lining up the program stage and sort of the venture stage is really where you want to focus. Let's see, how about, let's see, this one, criteria that judges understand and agree on what they mean and what constitutes low and high level. So I guess I'm just going to interpret this a little bit. So the first part of this is making sure that we're selecting criteria that the judges understand and agree on. I'm not sure the judges need to agree with your criteria. They certainly need to understand them. You want, again, the judge's job is to judge. Your job is to align the criteria with the sort of stage of your program and the stage the ventures are at, so that you get the outcome. And if there's a problem with your judges agreeing or not with your criteria, it may be that you need to move that particular judge or those judges to either a program that is more aligned with what their interests are. That's probably the best way to do it, is just to get them to be in front of ventures that more align with sort of their sensibilities. And then what constitutes high and low levels? So, every judge is going to, sort of have their own range. We typically prefer a 1 to 5 scale. That works really well. We found it gives a middle and also doesn't give so many choices that it stalls judges out. We found 1 to 10 and even 1 to 7 slows judges down quite a bit. And so 1 to 5 gives, there are a lot of attributes of 1 to 5 that makes a lot of sense. And so there are going to be some judges that won't give a 5, and there's going to be some judges that sort of don't give anything below a 3. But ultimately what we want, and so it's important that all judges evaluate all ventures or all participants within a cohort, within some bracket of people that are commonly being evaluated. But if we do that, then we're going to be able to have pretty reliable scores. Whether, again, what we want is a ballot that a given judge submits to represent ultimately not just the scores they would give these ventures, but the ranking. Because if we do that right, they're going to submit a ballot that ranks the ventures by the scores they give. And so making a system that allows that easily is key. And so then the whole idea is then when we aggregate that information together, we're going to take that sort of, if you will, hard judge, and they'll be sort of averaged into the easy judge or the mediocre judge or whatever the case might be. But ultimately, we want sort of each judge to have a very pure experience where what they submit is their viewpoint in terms of how these ventures rank. And then again, once we roll that in, we're going to be able to really easily get a good consensus and, in fact, very reliable scores. So score skewing, let's move on to this one. So when judges are exposed to multiple pitches back to back, the baseline for how the pitches are ranked starts to shift. If the first team had a strong performance, they might be scoring the one right after that a bit more harshly compared to the rest. The same problem is true if the opposite happens. A weak team making an average performance after having inflated numbers. what happens is judges' scores tallied up at the end look a bit skewed, and judges would prefer to discuss the results versus relying purely on the numerical scores. Exactly right. And this is why in the system we built, we actually have used some techniques to help judges not or to help judges judge consistently. In fact, we found that we've pretty much eliminated skewing by the techniques we've used. And so, in fact, when the judges go and meet, they don't need to talk first. In fact, we suggest that they look at the scores, the combined scores, the roll up of their scores, and the first question is really, do you agree with this ranking? And if not, why not? And so you can see that quickly, as opposed to having to spend 15 minutes trying to learn consensus when you go to that judges meeting, maybe or maybe even longer, being able to see consensus and a reliable consensus really moves that along much quicker. And in fact, the judges meetings that I go in using our tool, there is much more discussion around who's going to give out the awards than there is about a disagreement, if you will, on the rankings. There's much more agreement. That the conversation is much quicker, and if there is editing, it's usually just breaking a tie or a virtual tie, which no criteria is perfect, and so ultimately it's criteria don't more often than not aren't weighed, and so one idea might be there might be less friction in going to market, or maybe able to scale quicker, or whatever, sort of maybe the sort of a more preferred criteria to break the tie. And so it does simplify the process, but certainly score skewing happens. So the last question in score skewing: how do we override the judge's own bias? So I would argue that you don't want to override judge's bias. That's exactly why you invited that judge, is you want their bias, you want their point of view. And in fact, if you neutralize everybody's bias, then in fact the information isn't valuable at all. Everybody's going to sound the same. So right, wrong, or indifferent, every judge is trying to give you their best sense of point of view. And so it's how they view the world. And when the ventures go out into the real world, they're going to need to be able to listen to these comments from customers. They're going to need to listen to these comments from team members, employees, vendors, investors, etc. And it's much better that they hear the feedback in the safe collegial environs of your community, as opposed to hearing it for the first time when they go out into the quote unquote real world. So let's hop to judging process and result reliability. I know a few of these we've addressed, so we'll kind of go by them quickly. Getting all judges to follow the criteria. Again, this is, I think, an orientation issue, making sure that we reinforce that. And if people go off script, then then you don't invite them back, or you counsel them. But I think if you do a reasonable orientation, it doesn't need to be long or too involved. I haven't seen a situation where judges sort of go off script. It's really about first context, make sure they understand the context, the purpose of the event, and then understanding the criteria and how to apply those criteria sort of based on the context. How do you ensure that each judge has a common definition for each criteria? Well, it's simple. You define them. And certainly a part of saying that business model is a criteria is defining what you mean by that. So what are the couple of questions that judges should be looking to answer to make sure that the venture understands or has done what they need to satisfy the business model criteria? How do we get untrained judges to use rubrics reliably and quickly? I'm sounding like a broken record, but a good orientation. Some organizations we work with have gone to having, sort of a 15-minute sort of video orientation that judges can look at, sort of in the comfort of their own home. The more normal is that there's, an expectation that judges are on site 15 to 30 minutes early and go through a 5 to 15-minute orientation, and not just sort of meet each other and all that kind of stuff too. Let's see, next, making sure that we are awarding a team who is actually building a startup and not just successfully creating a story to show that he or she went through the process of learning through our instructed methods of customer discovery. Again, we want to align our criteria with the stage the ventures are at and their level of sophistication, and the stage of the program. What's our goal at this particular stage? And so are we more focused on encouragement and gaining commitment, or are we more focused on performance and getting the ventures to meet certain goals and to help their learning and ultimately their trajectory? So in this particular case, tailoring the criteria to these outcomes is really key. And the last question, to make sure that we provide reliable results and feedback to participants in our challenge events. So yeah, no, we just couldn't endorse or support more strongly the idea of not only sharing feedback, but democratizing the feedback. So when we when we share feedback, the reason we say democratize, in other words, share it broadly, not just with the participants, but the whole community. Think of how, so think of a place where results are shared broadly. So look at the sport of running. If you run in a marathon or in a Thanksgiving turkey trot, every single organizer, every event you go to, the organizer posts the results, usually within an hour of the completion of the event. You can go online and see the results, not just for yourself, but all participants. These results are available not only for you and all participants, but they're available for anyone that goes to that organization's website, not just right after the event, but for years. In fact, the first thing that a participant or a prospective participant in an event does is they go, before they sign up for an event, is they go and they look at the organization's website, and they'll look at last year or the last several years' results to see what they need to do to prepare for this event. What speed do I need to run at? What does my pace need to be? And that will inform how they train, how they prepare. So it's a big part of the community building for the sport of running. And in fact, runners come to events standing on the shoulders of previous participants. The future participants are able to participate at a higher level and to perform better by the learning and the performance of past participants. In entrepreneurship education, we are absolutely Darwinian in our approach to this, and we tend to not only not share our results in general with each individual, we don't share them with the cohort, and we don't share them with the community, and we do that at the complete detriment to the community's evolution and community building. So, we're gonna, the results first, we share them individually so that I know what I need to do to improve. We share them across the cohort so that I have relative comparisons about what better looks like. I can actually leapfrog some of the people I participate with. And finally, we share them with the community so that our future participants come in much better prepared, much better informed, and in fact, at a much higher level than our previous cohort. And we really want to leverage that information and knowledge so that we, again, continue to evolve and bring in higher and higher levels of participants who can really make us proud and really make our program cutting edge and leading. And so we see that the programs that are doing that really making remarkable success. So with that, my goodness, we have gone an hour, actually an hour and 3 minutes. So I apologize for going a bit long. We definitely would encourage anyone with additional questions or that wants to talk really about anything related to your program in any way that we can help. Please respond to us allow us to have a conversation. We'd love to hear and learn more about your program, and certainly share any of our learning with you as well. So with that, I wish you a great rest of your day and look forward to talking with you very soon. Thanks so much and have a wonderful day. Bye for now.